way good nights always do, quietly, with no warning of what was coming. A group of us had made plans to celebrate New Year's Eve at the Harborview Grand, the nicest hotel downtown. My brother-in-law was being honored at a company gala his firm was hosting there, and my wife thought it would be fun if we all went together. Kevin and Sandra were in. My sister and her husband said yes without hesitating. It seemed like a perfect way to end the year. I should probably explain who everyone is, because it matters. My sister Claire is 38 years old. She's smart, funny, and she has always been the kind of woman who walks into a room and makes it warmer just by being there. She married Ben 11 years ago, and I was the best man at their wedding. Ben is a project manager at a commercial construction firm downtown. He started there as a laborer right out of high school, worked his way up through every level, and became one of the most respected guys in the building. He and I have been friends since we were teenagers. He met Claire through me. Watching him fall for her was one of the best things I ever got to see up close. They have 2 kids together, Lily, who is 11, and Jake, who just turned 9. My wife Maggie and I have been married for 14 years. We don't have children of our own, which is something we made peace with a long time ago. Because of that, Lily and Jake mean everything to us. We are the fun aunt and uncle. We take them to ball games and spoil them with ice cream when Claire isn't looking. So that's the picture. 8 adults walking into a hotel ballroom on December 31st, all dressed up, all in a good mood, none of us knowing the night was about to split into before and after. The gala was packed. A live band was playing near the far wall, and the whole room smelled like champagne and expensive cologne. We found a table near the dance floor, ordered drinks, and settled in. Ben and Claire looked happy. They had been a little distant with each other for a few months. Nothing I could point to, just attention. I noticed the way you notice a small crack in a wall before it becomes a bigger problem. But that night, they seemed relaxed. She leaned her head on his shoulder while the band warmed up. He kissed the top of her head. I remember thinking, good. Whatever it was, they worked through it. Then Maggie grabbed my arm and nodded toward the entrance. Tyler Knox had just walked in. If you follow sports at all, you know the name. He played 6 seasons of professional baseball, made 2 All-Star appearances, and became one of the most recognizable faces in the city before a shoulder injury ended his career at 32. After that, he moved into broadcasting. He had a show on a regional sports network that had recently gone national. He was loud, charming, and he knew exactly how famous he was. He was the kind of man who doesn't walk into a room so much as arrive in it. I am not a sports person. I watch football maybe twice a year, mostly for the commercials. But I knew who Tyler Knox was because everyone in this city knew who Tyler Knox was. He came in with a group of people, handlers, I assumed, or friends who were comfortable orbiting someone with that kind of pull. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he scanned the room the way famous people do, like he was already deciding which version of the night he wanted to have. Claire noticed him. I saw it happen. She was in the middle of saying something to Sandra, and then her eyes went to the entrance, and for just a second she stopped talking. She recovered quickly, finished her sentence, laughed at something Sandra said. But I saw it. I looked at Ben. He was watching the band. The next hour was fine. We ate, we talked, we danced a little. Kevin told a story that went on too long, the way Kevin's stories always do. Sandra tried to get me to do a shot of tequila, and I declined. Ben and Claire danced twice, and she looked genuinely happy. I started to relax. Then Tyler Knox walked past our table. He slowed down when he saw Claire. He didn't stop immediately. He took a few more steps, then turned back like something had caught his eye. He smiled the smile of a man who has never once had to try very hard. He said something about how he didn't think it was possible to look that beautiful at the end of December. Claire laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh. She looked down for a second, then back up at him. Ben sat very still. Tyler Knox introduced himself, which was unnecessary, and Claire introduced herself back. He asked if she would like to dance. She looked at Ben. Ben said nothing. His jaw was set and his hands were flat on the table. She said, "Just one dance." Kevin immediately started talking. He said, "Come on, man, it's Tyler Knox." He said, "It's New Year's Eve." He said, "It's just a dance. Don't be that guy." Sandra laughed and said something about how this would be a great story. I looked at my wife. She looked back at me with the same expression I was feeling. Ben said nothing. He watched his wife walk out onto the dance floor with Tyler Knox. The first dance was a regular dance. The second dance was slower. By the third, I could feel the temperature at our table dropping 10 degrees. Ben stood up twice and sat back down. Kevin told him to relax both times. On the third time, Ben walked toward the dance floor, and two men in suits stepped out of nowhere and positioned themselves in front of him. They were Knox's people. They didn't say anything. They just stood there. Ben turned around and came back. His face was the color of concrete. I said something to him. I don't remember what. Something useless. Then Claire came back to the table. Tyler Knox was 2 steps behind her, his hand resting at the small of her back like he owned the real estate. She looked at Ben with an expression I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't apologetic either. It was the look of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the other person to catch up. She said, "Tyler has a place upstairs. I'm going to go with him for a little while." She said, "I'll be back in the morning. I love you." Then she smiled at Ben. She smiled at him the way you smile when you're telling someone everything is going to be fine. Ben said nothing. She walked away. She looked back once at the elevator and waved, a small cheerful wave like she was leaving a dinner party early. Kevin said, "Man, she's coming back." Maggie was already on her feet. Ben sat at that table for 30 seconds without moving. Then he stood up, and I could see him deciding something. I grabbed my jacket and told Maggie I had to go with him. I caught up to Ben at the lobby. He was standing near the elevator bank, staring at the numbers above the doors. He said, "What floor do you think he has?" I said it didn't matter because we weren't getting up there. I said what I wanted was for him to get in my car with me right now, because I had an idea. He said there was no point. He said it was over. I said, "It doesn't have to be, but we need to move." He looked at me for a long second. Then he followed me out. We sat in my car in the parking structure for 10 minutes. I didn't say anything grand or wise. I just sat next to my best friend while he looked at his hands and breathed. Then I said, "Let me tell you something about my sister that you might not know." He looked up. I told him that when Claire was 22, she went through a period of about 6 months where she was convinced she was missing out on something. She had been with the same boyfriend since high school, and she ended things with him not because anything was wrong, but because she had this feeling that there was a version of her life she hadn't explored. She spent those 6 months chasing something she couldn't even name. She was miserable. She came back to herself slowly, and she never really talked about it. But I watched it happen. And the man she ended up marrying, the man she has built her entire life with, is sitting next to me right now. Ben said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "Maybe not exactly. But I know my sister, and I know that whatever is happening right now is not who she is at her core." I said I wasn't asking him to forgive anything. I was asking him to give it one night before he made any permanent decisions. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." We drove home and I sat with him in my living room until almost 3 in the morning. Maggie came home by taxi, gave Ben a long hug, and made coffee. We didn't talk much. We just sat together. That's what you do. In the morning, Claire texted Ben. He didn't answer. She came to our house because she didn't know where else to go. She sat on our couch and said she knew she had made a terrible mistake. She said she didn't know how to explain it except that something had come over her, something she didn't have a name for. She said she had dreamed about something like that since she was a young woman, not Tyler Knox specifically, but the idea of being chosen by someone like that, someone the whole world was paying attention to. She said it had been a fantasy she thought she had given up long ago. And then, he was standing right in front of her, and the fantasy came rushing back. She said she had gone upstairs with him, and nothing had happened. She said she came to her senses in the elevator and told him she needed to go back to her husband. She said he hadn't been gracious about it. I didn't know whether to believe her. I told her that what mattered now wasn't what I believed. It was Ben. Ben had disappeared. He texted me once that morning, "I'm okay. Don't come looking." He spent 3 days staying with a college friend about 2 hours away. He texted me every day, short updates, nothing more. On the 4th day, he texted me and asked if I could set up a meeting at our parents' house. He said he wanted everyone there, Claire, me, Maggie, and our parents. He said he had some things he needed to say. He arrived at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday. He looked like he hadn't slept in 4 days, which was accurate. The bruise under his eye from where one of Knox's men had grabbed his arm was yellowing at the edges. He stood in the middle of my parents' kitchen and he talked. He said he was not going to pretend that what happened on New Year's Eve didn't happen. He said he was not going to let anyone in the room tell him he was overreacting or that it was just one night, or that he should be grateful she came back. He said he had heard enough of that already. He looked at Claire and told her that the image he couldn't get out of his head was not her walking onto the dance floor. It wasn't even her going to that elevator. It was the wave. The small, cheerful wave she gave him as the doors closed. He said it told him everything he needed to know about how she saw him in that moment. Then he said he had 3 choices. The first was to leave. He said he had thought about this seriously. The problem with leaving was that it would mean not watching Lily and Jake grow up in the same house. It would mean splitting what they had built, the house, their savings, their life. It would mean starting over at 40. It would mean Jake would have a different man in his home within a few years that he could not live with. The second choice was to do nothing and pretend it had never happened. He said that wasn't really a choice because it would just be a slow version of the first option. He would be gone in 2 years, just angrier. The third choice was to come back, but under terms he said. He pulled 2 envelopes from his jacket and put them on the table. He said they would have separate bank accounts from now on. They would each contribute to a joint account for household expenses and the kids. If she was unfaithful again, or if she put herself in a situation that a reasonable person would consider close to it, the house went to him, and he got primary custody. He had already spoken to a family attorney. The postnuptial agreement in the white envelope reflected all of this. The red envelope was divorce papers. He had signed them already. He said the decision was hers. Claire sat across from him and didn't move. My mother had tears running down her face and wasn't bothering to wipe them. My father stood by the window with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere outside. Claire picked up the white envelope. She looked at Ben and asked, "Do you still love me?" He said yes. She didn't open the envelope. She signed where she found the signature line, slid it back across the table, and looked at him without flinching. She said she was moving into the guest room. She said she understood why. Then she stood up, kissed my mother on the cheek, walked past Ben without touching him, and drove home. The next 4 months were the hardest I have ever watched 2 people go through. They lived in the same house, kept separate bedrooms, and moved around each other like 2 people who had memorized each other's routes to avoid collision. Ben threw himself into work. Claire was quieter than I had ever seen her, which was saying something because Claire had always been one of the loudest people in any room. They agreed to see a marriage counselor, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who had an office in a converted Victorian house on the east side of town. Ben agreed to it because he wanted to understand what had happened. Claire agreed to it because Ben was going. The sessions were hard in ways I only heard about secondhand. In one of the early sessions, Claire described the dream again, the celebrity fantasy, the feeling of being swept up by someone the world admired. Ben said he sat there and absorbed it and didn't say much. Then Dr. Contrips. Reyes asked him how he felt hearing that, and he said that he felt like 11 years of their life together had been a second-place ribbon. Claire said that wasn't what she meant at all. Ben said that wasn't the point. The point was that she had a version of herself she wanted to be that didn't include him, and she kept it locked away where he couldn't see it. And that was its own kind of betrayal before New Year's Eve ever happened. After one session in particular, Claire showed up at my house looking like someone had rearranged her from the inside. Maggie sat with her in the kitchen, and I stayed in the living room until I heard her call my name. She told me what had come out. She said that during the session she had mentioned the wave. She said she had meant it to be reassuring, a way of telling Ben she was coming back, that he didn't need to worry. She had thought she was being kind. Ben told her, through Dr. Reyes, that the wave had not said, "I'll be back." It said, "Watch this." It said, "Look who I'm going home with tonight." It said, "You are ordinary and he is not, and right now I'm choosing the other option." She put her hands flat on my kitchen table and stared at them. She said she had no idea. She said she would have given anything to unsay that wave. I told her that the problem was not that she had done something unforgivable. The problem was that she had never said the specific words that he needed to hear. Not generally sorry. Not, "I know I hurt you," but a full accounting, item by item, of what she had put him through. She looked at me and said, "I've said I'm sorry 100 times. I said, "To who?" She didn't answer. The next morning, Maggie came home from a walk and told me she had stopped by Claire's office and had a conversation that apparently sent my sister out the door running. I heard the front door of my house open 20 minutes later and Claire walked in without knocking, which was normal, and said she needed to find Ben right now. I told her he was at the job site on Halcyon Street. She was out the door before I finished the sentence. I heard about what happened from Ben that evening. She found him at the job site. She walked across a half-finished concrete floor in dress shoes, found him in a room full of blueprints, and said his name. He turned around. She said she was sorry for choosing that elevator over him. She said she was sorry for the wave. She was sorry for the smile she had given him when the doors closed, the one she had meant as comfort, and which had instead told him he wasn't enough. She said she was sorry for the fantasy she had kept from him for years, as if their life together wasn't worth sharing it with. She said she was sorry that he had spent 11 years being a husband, a father, and a man who showed up every single day, and she had made him feel in one night like none of that was sufficient. She said she was sorry for all of it, specifically and without softening any of it. He stood there in his work clothes and listened to every word. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he just pulled her in and held her. They didn't have a dramatic reconciliation scene. She moved back into their bedroom on a Thursday. He texted me a single word, Thursday. He texted me a single word, Thursday. I told Maggie. She cried a little, quietly, the way she does when she's relieved about something. But things were not fixed. That was the honest truth, and I want to be accurate about it because I think people deserve an accurate account. Over the next year, Ben was better. Not all the way back, but better. The sessions with Dr. Reyes continued. There were good weeks and hard weeks. He stopped carrying himself like a man who expected to be hit at any moment, which had been his posture for months. He laughed more. He came back to himself in slow increments, but there were nights he couldn't sleep. There were moments when Claire smiled at someone at a party and I could see him recalibrate something internally. He never said anything. He was working on it. I knew he was working on it, but I also knew that the thing that had been broken was still in the process of being repaired, and that process wasn't invisible. About 14 months after New Year's Eve, Maggie came to me with an idea. She had been thinking about it for a long time, she said. She was almost embarrassed to bring it up, because it sounded like something out of a movie. But she had been watching Ben, and she had talked to a friend of hers from work, a man named Dennis whose wife had gone through something similar years ago, and she thought she understood the wound in a way she hadn't before. She said Ben didn't feel like he had protected Claire that night. He had tried, and he had been blocked, and he had been knocked down. He had gone to that elevator and stood there helpless while the doors closed. Every time he thought about it, he was reminded that when the moment came, he hadn't been enough to stop it. She said, what if we gave him a different moment? What if we gave him a chance to be the one who stands between her and someone like that, and this time he wins? I sat with that for a minute. Maggie said she had already talked to Dennis. He owed her a favor, and he was a big man. Broad, imposing, the kind of presence that fills a doorway, and he was a good actor when he needed to be. He had been through his own version of this with his own wife, and he understood why it mattered. The plan was simple. My parents were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary in the spring. We were throwing them a party at a hotel downtown. A nice event, family and friends, and a few dozen people who had known my parents for decades. At some point in the evening, Dennis would approach Claire. He would be loud about it, the way Knox had been. He would tell her she was the most beautiful woman in the room. He would ask her to dance. He would not accept no graciously. He would escalate just enough to make Ben feel the pull to intervene. And then Ben would intervene. I told Maggie I thought it was either a brilliant idea or a catastrophic one, and I couldn't tell which. She said, I know, but I think he needs this. I said, okay. The party was on a Saturday evening in April. Everyone came cleaned up and in a good mood. My mother wore a blue dress she had bought for the occasion, and my father looked like he was trying very hard not to be visibly proud, which was exactly the way he always looked when he was the proudest. Dennis arrived about an hour in. I pointed him toward the bar and told him to give it another 30 minutes. He nodded and got himself a club soda. Just before 10, Claire announced she was tired and was going to head out. She made her way toward the exit, which took her along the edge of the dance floor. I watched from across the room. Maggie was at the table facing away, but I knew she was listening. Dennis put down his glass and stepped in front of Claire. He was loud. He said she was leaving too soon. He said someone like her shouldn't be leaving a party at 10 o'clock. He asked her to dance, and when she said no, he didn't move. He spread his arms a little and asked her again, smiling the way a man smiles when he has decided he isn't going to be denied. Claire said no again and tried to step around him. He stepped the same way. I watched Ben. He was at the bar with two of my cousins. He saw it happen. I watched him put down his glass. I watched him cross the room. He stepped between Dennis and Claire without saying her name or looking back at her. He looked up at Dennis, who had 4 inches and 50 pounds on him, and he said, my wife said no. I don't think she's going to change her answer. Dennis said, take it easy, little man. Ben said, I'm not taking it easy. She's not interested, and you need to step back. Dennis looked at him for a long moment. He was doing exactly what we had asked, making it real enough to matter without pushing it into something that would get anyone hurt. Then he raised his hands, said he didn't need the drama, and walked toward the exit. One of my cousins put a hand on Ben's shoulder and said, "Good man." I stayed where I was and watched. Claire had her hand on Ben's arm. He turned and looked at her, and I could see that something in him had shifted. Something had exhaled. She said his name very quietly. Then she put her arms around him, right there in the middle of the dance floor, and held on. He held her back. He held her the way you hold something you almost lost. They danced for a long time after that. When they came back to the table, Claire leaned over to Maggie and said something in her ear, and Maggie laughed and squeezed her hand. Nobody told them about Dennis. We never told them. Dennis texted me on the way out of the parking lot, and I texted back that he had done something genuinely good that night. A few months later, I ran into Dennis at a hardware store. He looked smaller without the borrowed suit. He said he was glad it had worked out. He said he understood what it was like to feel like you had stood in the wrong place at the wrong time and couldn't undo it. He said sometimes the only way forward was to let someone stand in the right place. I shook his hand for a long time. Ben and Claire had their second set of good years after that. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't without its hard moments. They stayed with Dr. Reyes for another 6 months, and then they stopped needing to. Billy started high school, and Ben coached Jake's Little League team. Claire came back to herself in ways I hadn't even realized she had gone. The family business, which my parents had handed me, kept them both employed and busy, which helped. Tyler Knox faded out of the regional sports coverage and moved to a national network. We heard later that a woman in another city had filed a civil complaint against him that was settled quietly. His broadcasts continued for a while, and then they didn't. I don't know what happened to him exactly, and I found that I didn't care very much. One evening, about 2 years after the anniversary party, I was sitting on my back porch with Ben after a barbecue. The kids were inside with Maggie watching something loud and animated. We were on our second beers and not talking about anything in particular. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." He said, "That guy at the party, at your parents' anniversary, do you know who he was?" I looked at my beer. He said, "I'm not angry. I just want to know if you know." I said, "Why do you think I'd know anything about that?" He smiled. He said, "Because you and Maggie are the only people I have ever met who would have the nerve to do something like that and the love to pull it off." I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said, "A friend of Maggie's. He owed her a favor. He understood what it was for." Ben nodded slowly. He took a drink. He looked at the yard for a while. He said, "It worked." I said I knew. He said, "Tell Maggie thank you. Tell her it was the thing that finally let me put it down." I said I would. We sat out there until the mosquitoes drove us inside, and then we sat at the kitchen table and talked for another 2 hours about nothing in particular, the way you can when the hard part is genuinely behind you. My sister came in from the living room at some point and handed Ben a piece of cold garlic bread, which he accepted without looking up from our conversation. She kissed the top of his head and went back to the couch. He took a bite of the bread. He kept talking. I thought, that's it. That's the whole thing. Not the party, not the post-nuptial agreement, not the counseling. That moment. Garlic bread on a Saturday night with nowhere to be and nothing left to prove. I don't tell this story because it has an easy lesson. I tell it because it happened, and because I was in the middle of it, and because if you have ever watched someone you love stand in the rubble of something they thought was permanent, you know that the rebuilding is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small ones. And sometimes it takes someone who loves you enough to engineer one of those moments on purpose. That's the only thing I know for certain.